In 1723, Anderson published, by authority of the Grand Lodge of England, the Constitutions of the Freemasons. Dr. Anderson was, no doubt, in possession of, or had access to, many sources of information in the way of old manuscripts which have since been lost, and with these, assisted in some measure by his own inventive genius, he has extended the brief legend of the craft to 34 quarto pages. But as this work was of an official character, and was written and published under the sanction of the Grand Lodge, and freely distributed among the lodges and masons of the time, the form of the legend adopted by him was accepted by the fraternity for a very long period as authentic. The Andersonian legend of the Tower of Babel molded, therefore, the belief of the English craft for at least the whole of the 18th century. Before giving any citations from the Andersonian version of the legend, it will be necessary to refer to another copy of the old constitutions. Dr. Krauss, the author of a learned Masonic work entitled The Three Oldest Documents of the Brotherhood of Freemasons, published in that work in 1810 a German translation of a document which he calls the York Constitutions. Footnote. Die drei Altsinn Kunststerkunden der Freimaurerr Bruderschaft, Volume 3, page 5. Of this document, Krauss gives the following account. He says that Brother Schneider of Altenburg had written communication from Brother Bottger, who stated that in the year 1799 he had seen at London a copy of the York Constitutions in a very old manuscript, consisting of 107 leaves in large folio, almost 1/3 of which he had been unable to read because it was written in the early English language, and hence he was forced to employ a learned Englishman as an interpreter. Schneider made diligent inquiries after this manuscript and eventually received a certified Latin translation made in 1806, from which in 1808 he composed a German version. This document Krauss supposes to be a genuine exemplar of the constitutions enacted at York in 926. The original manuscript has, however, never been found. It is not referred to in any of the records of the old Grand Lodge of York, and seems to have remained in mysterious obscurity until seen in 1799 by this Brother Bottger while on a visit to London. For these reasons, Findel deems it a spurious document. Brother Woodford, than whom there is none more competent to judge of questions of this kind, does not assent to this opinion, but, having his doubts, thinks the matter should remain in abeyance for the present. Brother Hugen, another accomplished critic, believes that it is probably a compilation of the early part of the last century. When the reader shall have collated the extracts about to be given from Anderson's Constitutions and the Krauss manuscript, he will, I think, concur with me that either Anderson had seen the latter manuscript, or that the author of it had been familiar with the work of Anderson. The general similarity of ideas, the collocation of certain words, and the use of particular phrases must lead to the conclusion that one of the two writers was acquainted with the production of the other. Which was the earlier one is not easily determined, nor is it important, since they were almost contemporaneous documents, and therefore they both show what was the form assumed by the legend in the early part of the 18th century. Footnote. The oftener I read this document and the more I reflect on its internal evidence, the more I become convinced that it was written after the first edition of Anderson's Constitutions, and perhaps after the second. Indeed, I am almost prepared to assign any part of the 18th century for the date of its composition. Andersonian version of the Babylon legend is as follows. Footnote. Constitutions, first edition, page 3. About 101 years after the flood, we find a vast number of the offspring of the sons of Noah, if not the whole race of Noah, in the Vale of Shinar, employed in building a city and large tower in order to make themselves a name and to prevent their dispersion. And though they carried on the work to a monstrous height, and by their vanity provoked God to confound their devices, by confounding their speech, which occasioned their dispersion, yet their skill in masonry is not the less to be celebrated, having spent above 53 years in that prodigious work, and upon their dispersion carried the mighty knowledge with them into distant parts, where they found the good use of it in the settlement of their kingdoms, commonwealths, and dynasties. And though afterwards it was lost in most parts of the earth, it was especially preserved in Shinar and Assyria, where Nimrod, the founder of that monarchy, after the dispersion, built many splendid cities, as Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar, from whence afterwards he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Calais, and Rezin. In these parts, upon the Tigris and the Euphrates, afterwards flourished many learned priests and mathematicians, known by the names of Chaldees and Magi, who preserved the good science, geometry, as the kings and great men encouraged the royal art. The Kraus manuscript, or the reputed York Constitutions, gives the Babylonian legend as follows. Footnote. See it in Hugin's Old Charges of the British Freemasons, page 80. It must be remembered that it is there an English version of the German which had been translated from a Latin translation of the original Old English, Ut Dictator. I have corrected a few errors in the translation of the old charges by a collation with the German of Kraus. 2 generations after Noah, his descendants, proud of their knowledge, built on a plain in the land of Shinar a great city and a high tower of lime, stones, and wood, in order that they might dwell together under the laws which their ancestor Noah had made known, and that the names of Noah's descendants might be preserved for all time. This arrogance, however, did not please the Lord in heaven, the lover of humility. Therefore he caused a confusion of their speech before the tower was finished, and scattered them in many uninhabited lands, whither they brought with them their laws and arts, and then founded kingdoms and principalities, as the holy books often testify. Nimrod, in particular, built a town of considerable size, but Noah's son, Shem, remained in Ur, in the land of the Chaldeans, and propagated a knowledge of all the arts and sciences abroad, and taught also Peleg, Serug, Nahor, Terah, and Abraham, the last of whom knew all the sciences, and had knowledge, and continued to instruct the sons of freeborn men, whence afterwards the numerous learned priests and mathematicians who have been known under the name of the wise Chaldeans. We have now 5 different documents presenting 3 different forms of the legend of the Tower of Babel. Number 1, Hallowell poem. This legend briefly recounts the facts of the building of the tower and the subsequent interruption of the work by the confusion of tongues and the dispersion of the builders. By an anachronism, Nebuchadnezzar is designated as the monarch who directed the construction. Not a word is said about the institution of Masonry at that time. In fact, the theory of the Hallowell manuscript seems rather to be that Masonry was, many years after, taught for the first time in Egypt by Euclid. The form of the legend was never accepted by the operative Masons of the Guild, certainly not after the end of the 15th century. Number 2, the Cook and later manuscripts. This form of the legend ascribes the origin of Masonry to the era of the building of the tower. Nimrod is made the Grand Master and makes the first charge, that is, frames the first constitution that the Masons ever had. Ashur, the son of Shem, is also represented as a great Mason, the builder of the city of Nineveh, and to whom Nimrod sent workmen to assist him. From Babylon, Masonry was carried next into Egypt. This form of the legend, first presented in the Cook manuscript, and followed almost literally in the Dowland and all the succeeding manuscript constitutions, seems to have embodied the prevailing belief of the fraternity until about the end of the 17th or the beginning of the 18th century. Number 3, the Andersonian and the York constitutions. In these, the form of the legend is greatly improved. The idea that Masonry was first established with appropriate laws at the Tower of Babel under the superintendence of Nimrod is still preserved. But Ashur no longer appears as a builder of cities assisted by his cousin, but is transformed and correctly too into the kingdom of Assyria, where Nimrod himself built Nineveh and other cities. And the next appearance of Masonry is said to be not in Egypt, as in the preceding manuscripts, but is said to have been propagated after the dispersion by the Magi in the land of the Chaldeans. This form of the legend prevailed during perhaps the whole of the 18th century. It became the settled conviction of the Masons of that period that Masonry was instituted at the Tower of Babel by Nimrod and thence propagated to the Chaldeans. Thus, in Smith's use and abuse of Freemasonry, footnote, Op. Citation, page 29. Published in 1783, it is said that after the flood, the Masons were first called Noahide, and afterwards sages or wise men, Chaldeans, etc. And Northook, who in 1784, by order of the Grand Lodge, published an edition of the constitutions far superior to that of Anderson. It says, footnote, Opus citation, page 11, that Nimrod founded the empire of Babylon, and that under him flourished those learned mathematicians whose successors were styled magi or wise men. But about the end of the last century, or perhaps still later, about the beginning of the present, this legendary account of the origin of Freemasonry began to be repudiated, and another one, in contradiction of the old manuscripts, was substituted for it.